The Atlas 6x6 is finally up and running with the TRX4M transmission and SCX24 style portal axles. If you'd like to learn more about this epic build, stick around, it's coming up next. G'day YouTube, welcome back to the channel. I know there's a few of you guys out there who have been interested in finding out more information on how I installed the TRX4M transmission in the Atlas 6x6. I've also installed SCX24 style nylon portal axles. So let's jump into it and let's see what it takes to install that transmission and how I went about bolting those axles on. We'll start off with the transmission install. I'll remove the transmission from the truck so I can show you exactly how I got it installed in the vehicle. To get the TRX4M transmission bolted into the Atlas, it's actually really easy. You can see I've attached 4 2mm rod ends onto the factory transmission mounting points on the Traxxas transmission there. And I've used these rod ends that I got off eBay. I bought a bunch of these for building FCX24 suspension links. But you can get these things all over eBay and Amazon. They're pretty easy to find and they're inexpensive too. So you can see that I've cut the rod ends shorter, basically where that hex section at the back is. I've just cut that hex section off. That leaves enough to use a short M2 screw to attach it onto the transmission. The stock Atlas drive shafts also attach directly onto the TRX4M transmission. They're a snug fit, but they go on easily. That's pretty much the only preparation for the transmission end. The next step, you're going to need some M2 or 2mm threaded machine screws. These have got a 1.5mm button hex head on them, and the threaded section measures about 15.7mm. You will need some super long screws, and I'll show you why. If you look way down into the belly of the beast there, you can see that screw sticking way out. Now that screw comes through the fake exhaust pipe there, passes through the chassis, passes through the skid plate and sticks right into the transmission mounting area. The extra long bolts, they pass through and they actually pick up on these rod ends there. 4 screws anchoring this transmission down into that skid plate. Now there's no nuts or anything on the back side. These rod ends, sort of a snug fit between that skid plate there. Not a lot of modification. I did start cutting a little bit of plastic out of the bottom of the skid there. I had a different idea in mind at the time for mounting the transmission. I didn't end up going that route because this was even simpler. Just 4 long screws, 4 2mm rod ends, and a couple of short 2mm screws for the transmission. It's dead simple, and it's basically a bolt-in affair. So that's really cool. I was pretty happy when I came up with that. It's super secure in there. It does flex a little bit if you twist transmission around, but in the torque direction and front to rear, the mounting's incredibly stiff, so I'm not really worried about that little bit of twisting motion. The only sort of force that these mounts are subject to is compression and tension while that transmission's trying to push the truck around. So with the transmission installed and running the stock front and rear Atlas 6x6 drive shafts, let's talk about installing the SCX24 style portal axles. These are the generic nylon portals from Mofo RC. I'll leave a link in the description. Getting them installed is fairly straightforward, but with them being portal axles, they're going to raise the ride height of the vehicle, and that was a major decision-making factor in how I set up the links and the shock mounts when installing these axles. Because the portals raise the vehicle up, I wanted to make sure that I didn't mount the shocks on the stock SCX24 shock mount, which sits on top of the axle tube, and it's a little bit too high. This thing would have been sitting up like a monster truck. So I decided I wanted to mount the shocks onto the same mounting point as the lower links here. To get the stock Atlas 6x6 shocks mounted to the same location as the lower links, I've used these M1.4 screws. They're 16 millimeters long, and that allows us to run it through the shock and through the lower link itself, attaching it all onto the one mount there. But to get the shocks to articulate correctly and not bind on anything, I've used these two little M1.4 stainless steel nuts threaded on there, and that just acts as a spacer to keep these shocks running in the right position. In these little generic SCX24 screw kits that you can get online, they have these little rod ends, and the rod ends are designed to be retained by a tiny little O-ring. I've used the rod ends and a single O-ring to convert the stock Atlas links and make them the right size to attach into the SCX24 axles. So for the rear axle, I'm just running the stock upper and lower links. I've got a little bit of tire rub between the two sets of rear tires at the moment, so I think what I'm going to do is cut the links off here and attach an Endura SCX24 style rod end onto the end of that link, just to lengthen it out slightly and make sure I don't have any tire rub. For the mid axle, I'm using the stock Atlas lower links. The pinion angle using the stock upper links was way off, and this shaft heading out towards the back axle was sort of pointing up on a crazy angle. To fix that, I ended up modifying the stock upper links. I just cut them short and attached these Endura SCX24 rod ends. Those rod ends come with a 2mm grub screw, a long threaded grub screw in the kits. So I was able to just drill and tap these stock links, and that gave me a way to attach these SCX24 rod ends. The front and center drive shafts are stock Atlas 6x6 shafts. They fit perfectly and the lengths are correct. I haven't had an issue with any of those coming off or twisting or breaking so far. The rear shaft was too short, so I had to substitute in this FCX24 shaft. I think this came with the original FCX24 as an upgrade in the package. I've since modified mine, so I had these left over, and they were a perfect fit. They were a little bit too long. I had to cut about 1/8 of an inch off both halves of the shaft, and now it fits in there perfect, and there's no binding while the suspension articulates. For the front end, I was able to utilize the Atlas 6x6 lower links. I ended up getting rid of the 3-link setup. I wasn't able to make that work with these axles. I've got a pair of custom upper links. I haven't finished them yet. I've still got to put brass sleeves on there to complete them. So now it's got a functional dual triangulated 4-link. One issue that arose from mounting the shocks really low to the same location as the lower links, there's not enough room above the front axle to have the servo mounted. So I didn't want to put the servo on top of the axle because that would have caused the front of the vehicle to sit really, really high. I wanted to keep this thing as low as possible. So I decided to stick with the chassis mounted servo in the stock location and just make a custom drag link to attach that. There's no panhard bar, so with the 4-link and the chassis mounted servo, it's not a perfect combination, That combination does create a phenomenon called bump steer, where as you move the axle through its full travel, the steering angle changes, which isn't ideal. But this truck sits with that drag link level at ride height, and that doesn't really change as the suspension articulates. So in practice, on a toy truck like this, it's not really a huge deal. For convenience at the moment, that's the setup that I'm going to stick with. It's been a really long road since I first got the Atlas 6x6 and quickly realized that it left a lot to be desired and needed a ton of work to be a functional rock crawler. With the TRX4M transmission and SCX24 axles, it's finally reliable and robust that I can take it out and drive the thing, and I've got a really good baseline setup that I can continue to improve and make adjustments to. One of the biggest reasons, in my opinion, to install SCX24 worm gear axles in a 6x6 build like this is that it completely eliminates any torque reaction on the mid-axle. You've probably seen videos of the Atlas 6x6. Anytime the vehicle's under load and really trying to push through an obstacle, you can see that mid-axle wrapping up and causing the tyre to lift. What that actually does is jacks the other tyres up off the ground, and it limits traction to the rear of the vehicle. With the SCX24 axles, there's no ring and pinion gears in here, so the rear axle has a direct mechanical link to the transmission itself, and that completely eliminates any torque reaction. You can see I'm going to hold the vehicle back by hand here and drive it forwards, and you can see that that mid-axle is not on the ground, the rear tyres are spinning, and there's zero torque reaction there at all. And that aspect alone has a huge impact on the way the vehicle climbs. Stock out of the box, I was able to get the Atlas to climb our incline ramp set at 55 degrees. The center of gravity has since been raised. The SCX24 portal axles raise the vehicle up. The TRX4M transmission is larger, the motor is heavier, and it sits up higher in the chassis. So this vehicle's at a disadvantage center of gravity wise to the stock setup. However, it's able to climb the incline ramp set at 58 degrees, which is an insanely steep angle, and it really just proves without that torque reaction at the rear axle, all four tires at the back are able to stay on the ground for longer. You do still get a traditional torque twist and lifting of one of the front tires, but 58 degrees for a large top heavy vehicle like this I think is insane. At 58 degrees, these mini Swamp King tyres were struggling for traction, but I just wanted to highlight how eliminating that mid-axle torque reaction really keeps the tyres planted on the ground, and it makes a huge difference in the climbing angle this vehicle can achieve. The stock Atlas setup at 55 degrees was only contacting the ramp on 3 tyres. 1 tyre at the front axle, 1 tyre at the mid axle, and 1 tyre at the rear axle. So 3 contact patches to drive it up a 55-degree ramp. As you increase the amount of tyres touching the ground, obviously the traction goes up. At 58 degrees, this vehicle had all 4 rear tyres touching and 1 of the front tyres touching, so that's a huge increase in traction. That's where I'm going to wrap up this build for the minute. I'll let the video finish out with some running footage of this Atlas 6x6 in action for anybody who's interested. You will be seeing this vehicle more in future videos as I make improvements and other changes to it. It's likely that I'll change the motor and ESC to something different. I haven't decided yet. I would like to run the vehicle on 3, maybe even 4S, so we'll see what happens with that in the future. If you got any value out of today's content, please consider subscribing to the channel, and I'll catch you on the next video. I'm super stoked with how this Atlas build has turned out. It's an absolute ton of fun to drive on the rocks. As it sits here, it's a little bit top heavy. It would definitely benefit from some weighted wheels, maybe even some brass in those portals, but it's still incredibly capable. That long wheelbase is able to bridge gaps and traverse terrain that you just wouldn't even think possible. The slow crawl on this setup's not too bad. The Holmes Hobbies Torquemaster Mini 66 turns doing a great job. It's got a ton of torque and it doesn't have any issues pushing this truck along. The cheapy little Hobby Plus ESC I've got in there, it's pretty smooth. It doesn't do a bad job, but the minimum speed, the minimum throttle right from the get-go, it's a little bit jumpier than I'd like, so that's definitely something I want to improve. I'd like to get a better ESC in there and maybe even bump this thing up to 3S. The wheel speed for what I'm looking for is still lacking. When you're coming down a steep hill, if the truck goes to loop out, you just don't have enough wheel speed to save yourself. So that's something I want to look at improving moving forward. But as a baseline setup, I'm really enjoying this truck so far. The stock wheels and tires that came on the Atlas, I really liked the look of them. I think they had a really awesome scale look. Unfortunately, they didn't hook up on the rocks quite as well as I needed them to. I originally wanted to put the Proline Baja Pro X on this truck. I'm running them on my TRX4M Bronco. They're an awesome looking tire and they do really well on that Bronco. When I realized you could get the LGRP Swamp Kings in the smaller 57mm size, I decided to pick those up and give them a try, and I'm really glad that I did. They're an awesome tire. The aggressive looks, I think, match up really well with this Atlas build, and they don't have any issues propelling this thing forwards on the rocks. I found with the stock Atlas 6x6 that I hung up on the diff housings a lot. These portal axles give an absolute ton of clearance. The front axle does hook up a little bit with its large C-hub design, but being that that's the steering axle, I find it's pretty easy to avoid getting the front axle hung just by steering the truck one way or another. The rear axle housings are super clean, and the back of this thing just glides over the rocks, and it's really difficult to get the back end of it hung up, so that's something that's pretty neat. This obstacle here is fairly new on the course. The little Enduro buggies practically leap up here, being a really lightweight truck. I wasn't sure how the Atlas was going to handle it, but with a little bit of maneuvering and a little bit of burst of throttle, I was able to jump the truck up there eventually. This drop off here is always a lot of fun. You normally need a ton of wheel speed to be able to get out of it safely, but I was able to get the axle to hook up on the ledge and lower the truck down, Again, having that long wheelbase gives this thing all kinds of stability when things get vertical. I hope you guys enjoyed the build process on the Atlas 6x6. I hope I was able to give you some useful information for your own 6x6 builds. If you enjoyed the video, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I will catch you next time.